Marcus Chen had always been terrible at following orders, which was exactly why he found himself alone on the mining platform Kepler 442b, instead of safely aboard the evacuation ships with the rest of humanity's outer rim colonists. The Zephyrian Empire's ultimatum had been clear. All human settlements beyond the Sol system had 72 hours to evacuate or face cleansing protocols. Most humans had packed up and left, abandoning decades of terraforming work and mineral extraction operations. But Marcus wasn't most humans. The 34-year-old geologist had spent 8 years on this rock, mapping every cave system and mineral vein. He knew the planet better than anyone, and he'd be damned if he'd let some purple-skinned empire claim his life's work without a fight. So when the last transport lifted off, Marcus stayed behind with enough supplies to last 6 months and a stubborn conviction that the Zephyrians wouldn't waste resources on a single human hiding in the deep caves. He was wrong about that last part. The bombardment started on the 3rd day. Marcus watched from his hidden observatory as Zephyrian dreadnoughts turned the surface into molten glass. They weren't just claiming the planet, they were sterilizing it. Every structure, every trace of human presence, everything burned under plasma fire that could be seen from orbit. Marcus retreated deeper into the cave system, following tunnels he'd mapped years earlier. The bombardment continued for 6 hours, then stopped as suddenly as it began. Through his scanner equipment, he detected Zephyrian landing parties deploying across the devastated surface. They were conducting sweeps, hunting for any survivors. 3 weeks later, Marcus had become something between a ghost and a legend in his own mind. He moved through the deepest caves, surviving on recycled water and protein bars, avoiding the systematic Zephyrian patrols. His equipment told him they were conducting detailed geological surveys, probably mapping the planet's resources for their own mining operations. That's when he found the eggs. The chamber was deeper than any cave system he'd previously mapped, accessible only through a narrow tunnel that required 2 hours of careful climbing. His headlamp illuminated a vast underground cavern, easily the size of a small city. But what caught his attention weren't the impressive stalactite formations or the underground lake. It was the nest. 12 eggs, each roughly the size of a human torso, sat arranged in a perfect circle at the center of the cavern. They pulsed with a faint bioluminescent glow that shifted between deep purple and electric blue. The temperature in the chamber was significantly warmer than the surrounding cave system, and Marcus's scanner detected complex organic compounds he'd never seen before. As he approached the nest, one of the eggs began to crack. Marcus froze, his engineering instincts warring with basic survival sense. These were clearly not human artifacts, and given the Zephyrian presence above, they might belong to the enemy. But as the first egg split open and something small and vulnerable emerged, Marcus found himself moving forward instead of backing away. The creature that hatched was unlike anything in his xenobiology database. It stood roughly knee-high, with iridescent scales that reflected his headlamp like polished metal. 4 legs supported a serpentine body, while a pair of wings, far too small for flight, sprouted from its shoulders. Most striking were its eyes, large, intelligent, and unmistakably aware as they focused on Marcus with what appeared to be recognition. The hatchling made a sound somewhere between a bird's chirp and a cat's purr, then took 3 tentative steps toward him. More eggs began cracking. Within an hour, Marcus found himself surrounded by 12 newly hatched creatures, all of them treating him as if he were their parent. His scanner couldn't identify their species, but certain readings troubled him. The creatures registered massive electromagnetic signatures. Their body temperature ran significantly higher than any known life form, and they seemed to generate their own gravitational field distortions. Whatever these things were, they weren't ordinary animals. Marcus made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. He decided to protect them. Over the next several days, he established a routine. The hatchlings, he'd started thinking of them as his kids, though he knew that was probably dangerous, required almost constant attention. They ate constantly, consuming everything from cave moss to metal ore with equal enthusiasm. They learned at an incredible rate, mastering basic problem-solving within hours and beginning to communicate through a complex series of chirps, growls, and harmonics within days. Most importantly, they trusted him completely. Marcus had never been a father, had never even been particularly good with children. But these creatures responded to his care with absolute loyalty. They followed him through the cave system, learned to hide when his motion detectors warned of approaching Zephyrian patrols, and seemed to understand that the world above was dangerous. By the end of the first week, Marcus noticed changes in their behavior. The largest of the group, he'd named her Vera, had begun generating small electrical discharges when excited. Another, smaller and more curious than the rest, could somehow move small objects without touching them. A third had developed the ability to become nearly invisible, its scales adapting to match the surrounding rock. Marcus began keeping detailed notes, partly from scientific curiosity, and partly because he sensed these observations might prove important. The creatures were developing abilities that shouldn't exist according to known physics. They were growing larger each day, their intelligence expanding at rates that suggested they might soon surpass human cognitive capabilities. 2 weeks after finding them, Marcus discovered just how much trouble he was in. The Zephyrian patrol found his hideout purely by accident. Marcus had been teaching the hatchlings to hunt cave fish when his motion sensors screamed warnings throughout the tunnels. 6 Zephyrian soldiers in full combat gear were approaching through the main tunnel, following heat signatures that Marcus thought he'd been masking effectively. Marcus gathered the 12 hatchlings, now roughly the size of large dogs, and led them deeper into the cave system. But the tunnels here were narrower, offering fewer escape routes. The Zephyrian patrol was systematic and patient, following tracks that Marcus hadn't realized he was leaving. They cornered him in a dead-end chamber 3 hours later. "Human survivor located," announced the Zephyrian patrol leader in heavily accented standard. "Surrender for processing." Marcus stood between the soldiers and his charges, though he knew his pistol was worthless against their combat armor. The hatchlings crowded behind him, making soft, worried sounds that almost broke his heart. After 3 weeks of caring for them, the thought of Zephyrian soldiers harming them filled him with protective rage. "Stay back," Marcus warned, raising his weapon. "I'm not going anywhere." The Zephyrian leader's translator rendered his laughter as mechanical clicking. "Human shows defiance. Amusing. Surrender now and death will be quick." "I said stay back." The soldiers raised their plasma rifles. Marcus closed his eyes, thinking of the 12 creatures he'd failed to protect, wondering if anyone would ever know what had happened to them. That's when Vera stepped in front of him and roared. The sound was nothing like the gentle chirps and purrs Marcus had grown accustomed to. This was something primal and terrible, a noise that seemed to vibrate in dimensions beyond normal sound. The cave walls trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. Several of Marcus's instruments simply stopped working. But the effect on the Zephyrian soldiers was far more dramatic. All 6 of them dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, their combat armor sparking and failing. Their translator units screamed in electronic agony before shutting down completely. One soldier began what sounded like panicked prayers in his native language. The patrol leader, struggling to remain upright, managed to activate his emergency communicator with shaking hands. Marcus's universal translator picked up fragments. "Command! Impossible! The legends! They're real." Vera took another step forward, and 11 more hatchlings moved to flank her. They were no longer making gentle sounds. The harmonics they generated seemed to press against Marcus's consciousness, filling him with primal certainty of their power and authority. The Zephyrian soldiers fled. Marcus stood in the suddenly quiet chamber, staring at creatures he'd thought he understood. Vera turned back to him, her enormous eyes reflecting his headlamp, and made the same gentle purring sound she'd made the day she hatched. The others crowded around him, seeking the scratches and attention they'd always craved. But Marcus had seen something in that moment of confrontation, something in the way the Zephyrian soldiers had reacted. Terror, yes, but more than that, recognition. They had known what these creatures were. As he led his charges deeper into the cave system, Marcus began to realize that he might have made the most significant discovery in human history, or the most dangerous mistake. The hatchlings followed him through the tunnels, trusting and affectionate as always. But now Marcus noticed details he'd missed before. The way their eyes tracked movement in complete darkness, how their scales seemed to absorb and redirect energy, the subtle gravitational distortions that followed them wherever they went. Whatever these creatures were, they were far more than simple animals. And if the Zephyrian reaction was any indication, they might be the most feared beings in the galaxy. Marcus had raised them from eggs, taught them to trust humans, and earned their absolute loyalty. The question that would haunt him for weeks to come was simple. What happened when they grew up? Deep in the caves of Kepler 442b, 12 dragon hatchlings followed their adopted human father through tunnels that would soon prove too small to contain them. Above ground, Zephyrian commanders frantically transmitted reports that would send shockwaves through an empire that had conquered half the galaxy. The legends spoke of creatures so powerful that entire civilizations would kneel before them. Ancient texts described beings that could bend space and time, whose very presence commanded absolute obedience from lesser species. Those legends had just walked out of myth and into reality, raised by a human who had no idea what he'd done. The emergency session of the Zephyrian High Command convened within 6 hours of Patrol Leader Kexthan's transmission from Kepler 442b. Grand Admiral Velter had ruled the Empire's military forces for 3 decades, crushing rebellions and annexing systems with methodical efficiency. But as he reviewed the patrol footage and listened to Kexthan's stammering report, his purple skin had taken on the pale shade that indicated genuine fear. "Show the recording again," Velter commanded. The holographic display flickered to life, showing blurry combat footage from Kexthan's helmet camera. Most of the visual was corrupted by electromagnetic interference, but the audio was clear enough, that otherworldly roar that had made 6 veteran soldiers flee in terror. Commander Zixnal, the Empire's chief xenobiologist, leaned forward in her chair. "The harmonic signature matches references from the Forbidden Archives. This is impossible." "Explain," Velter growled. "The archives contain fragments of pre-Empire records, legends that our ancestors collected from conquered civilizations. Most consider them mythology, stories told by primitive species to explain natural phenomena they couldn't understand. But certain details appear across dozens of unconnected worlds." Zixnal activated her personal tablet, projecting ancient text onto the display. The Kellari called them star shapers. The extinct Morphean Empire recorded them as world enders. The Thresh civilization carved warnings about the ancient flame into their sacred sites before vanishing entirely. "Myths and legends," Velter dismissed, though uncertainty colored his voice. "Perhaps, but every legend describes the same characteristics. Massive reptilian beings capable of manipulating fundamental forces, commanding absolute obedience from lesser species through presence alone. They were said to appear rarely, usually during periods of cosmic transition, and their awakening always preceded the fall of established orders." The recording played again, that terrible roar echoing through the command chamber. Several junior officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "The last confirmed sighting was over 8,000 years ago," Zixnal continued. "A Thresh probe recorded visual confirmation before their civilization collapsed completely. After that, nothing. Most xenoarchaeologists assumed the species had gone extinct or ascended to higher dimensional existence." "Until now," Velter said quietly. "The creatures Kexthan encountered were juveniles. Based on size estimates from his scanner data, they're approximately 4 weeks post-hatching. Adult specimens, according to the legends, can reach lengths of several hundred meters and possess capabilities that violate known physical laws." Grand Admiral Velter studied the strategic map of local space. Kepler 442b sat on the edge of Zephyrian territory, close to the border with the Terran Federation. If these legendary creatures were real, and if they were under human protection. "What's the status of our military presence in that sector?" "The Fourth Fleet maintains patrol routes through 12 systems," reported Admiral Kylvar. "Approximately 40,000 personnel, including 3 dreadnoughts and 47 support vessels." "Mobilize everything. I want a full blockade around Kepler 442b within 48 hours. "Sir, that's significant overkill for one human survivor and some unidentified creatures." Velter's eyes narrowed. "Admiral, if the legends are accurate, those unidentified creatures could represent the greatest threat our empire has ever faced. We cannot allow them to reach maturity." 3 levels below the command center, in the deepest archives of Zephyrian Central Intelligence, Analysis Director Morgoth was having similar concerns. But unlike the military leadership focused on immediate threats, Morgoth understood the broader implications. She stood before the massive quantum storage arrays that held 10,000 years of conquered civilizations' records. Her clearance allowed access to materials that most Zephyrians didn't know existed: religious texts, scientific observations, and historical accounts from species the Empire had absorbed or destroyed. Archive search, references to large reptilian entities with supernatural capabilities, she commanded. The quantum processors hummed for several minutes before displaying results. Thousands of documents appeared, spanning dozens of civilizations across galactic history. Morgoth had spent her career analyzing patterns in conquered knowledge, and what she saw now filled her with dread. Every major civilization that had recorded encounters with these beings had fallen within a generation. Not through direct conflict, but through fundamental changes in their social structure, technological development, or cosmic awareness that made their previous existence impossible. The Kelari had achieved faster-than-light travel only after encounters with star shapers. Their civilization had lasted another 300 years before transcending physical existence entirely. The Morphians had developed consciousness transfer technology following contact with world-enders, then abandoned their physical forms voluntarily. The pattern was consistent. Contact with these creatures led to rapid advancement, followed by transformation beyond anything resembling normal civilization. But there was something else in the records, something that made Morgoth's blood run cold. In every single case, the creatures had chosen their initial contact species carefully. They didn't appear randomly, they selected civilizations that demonstrated specific qualities: curiosity, adaptability, protective instincts toward other species, willingness to sacrifice for principles rather than convenience. Qualities that the Zephyrian Empire had spent centuries eliminating from its own culture. Qualities that humans possessed in abundance. Meanwhile, in the deep caves of Kepler 442b, Marcus was beginning to understand that his situation had grown far more complex than simple survival. The Zephyrian patrol's reaction had been too specific, too terrified, to represent a normal response to unknown creatures. They had recognized his charges as something particular and significant. The hatchlings themselves seemed aware that something had changed. They were more alert now, often stopping their activities to stare toward the surface with expressions that suggested they could sense things Marcus couldn't detect. Vera had grown noticeably larger, now standing nearly chest-high when she stretched her neck upward. The others showed similar growth rates, their scales becoming more lustrous and their movements increasingly coordinated. Most concerning was their developing communication. Marcus had initially assumed their chirps and harmonics were simple emotional expressions, but over the past several days, he'd noticed patterns that suggested actual language. They were having conversations with each other, conversations that became quiet when he approached. "What are you thinking about?" he asked Vera as she stared toward the cave entrance. She turned to him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, then made a series of soft harmonics that somehow conveyed complex meaning. Danger approaching, preparation necessary, protection offered. Marcus felt understanding flow into his mind, not through words but through direct emotional transmission. Vera was telling him that she could sense ships gathering above, that hostile forces were mobilizing, and that she and her siblings would keep him safe. "You can sense what's happening on the surface." More harmonics, accompanied by mental images that made Marcus stagger. He saw the cave system from above, then pulled back to see the planet, then further back to observe dozens of ships taking positions around Kepler 442b. The perspective continued expanding until he could see the entire local sector, with ship movements tracked in real time. One of the hatchlings could sense things across interstellar space. "How is that possible?" Vera approached and pressed her scaled head against his chest, the way she had when she was newly hatched. But now the gesture carried additional meaning: trust, protection, and something else, something that felt like destiny. Marcus realized that the next few days would determine not just his survival, but possibly the future of human space expansion. The Zephyrian Empire had come to eliminate threats on a minor mining world and discovered something that terrified them enough to mobilize an entire fleet. He was alone on a hostile world with 12 rapidly growing creatures that might represent the most significant discovery in galactic history. Every decision he made from here forward would have consequences he couldn't fully understand. As if responding to his thoughts, all 12 hatchlings gathered around him in a circle. They began harmonizing together, their combined voices creating frequencies that seemed to resonate through dimensions beyond normal space. Marcus felt power gathering in the chamber, energy that made his hair stand on end, and his equipment register readings that shouldn't be possible. Through the harmonic communication, he sensed their unanimous decision. They would protect their human caregiver against any threat, regardless of the consequences. Above ground, Zephyrian sensors detected massive energy signatures emanating from deep within the planet's crust. Energy readings that didn't match any known weapon or natural phenomenon. Energy signatures that made veteran fleet commanders order their ships to maintain maximum safe distance. The blockade was forming, but Admiral Velter was beginning to understand that they might be the ones who were trapped. Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Federation Navy had been monitoring Zephyrian fleet movements for 6 months, but the massive mobilization around Kepler 442b caught her completely off guard. 43 enemy vessels surrounding a supposedly dead mining world made no strategic sense unless the Zephyrians had discovered something extraordinarily valuable. Intelligence assessment? She asked her analyst team aboard the TFS Prometheus. No official Federation presence in that system since the evacuation order, reported Commander Williams. Last transport lifted off 39 days ago. The planet should be empty. Should be, but the Zephyrians are treating it like a major military objective. Admiral Chen studied the tactical display showing Zephyrian ship positions. They're maintaining maximum safe distance, which suggests they're afraid of something down there. Perhaps survivors with advanced weaponry. 43 ships for a handful of mining colonists? I don't think so. Chen had fought Zephyrians for 8 years and knew their tactical patterns. They were methodical, efficient, and never deployed more force than necessary. This level of mobilization suggested genuine fear. Ma'am, we're receiving a priority transmission from Zephyrian Command. They're demanding immediate communication with Federation leadership. Admiral Chen raised an eyebrow, put them through. Grand Admiral Velter's image appeared on the display, his purple skin showing stress patterns that indicated extreme agitation. Admiral Chen, we must discuss the situation at Kepler 442b immediately. I'm listening, Admiral. Your species has awakened something that should have remained dormant. We demand immediate Federation cooperation in containing this threat. What threat? Our intelligence shows no Federation assets in that system. Velter's expression darkened. Do not play ignorant, human. Your survivor has interfered with forces beyond your comprehension. If these creatures reach maturity, they will destabilize the entire galactic order. Admiral Chen kept her expression neutral despite her confusion. What creatures? The legends speak of beings that reshape reality through will alone. Your species' tendency toward irrational protective behavior has created a catastrophic situation. We offer one opportunity. Surrender the human and allow us to resolve this properly. Even if I knew what you were talking about, Admiral, the Federation doesn't abandon its citizens. Then you condemn yourself to the same fate as the Kalari and Morphians. Velter's transmission ended abruptly. Admiral Chen stared at the blank display. Commander Williams, I want everything our Xenoarchaeology department has on extinct civilizations, particularly the Kalari and Morphians, and get me a secure channel to Federation Command immediately. Yes, ma'am. Should we move closer to investigate? Chen considered the tactical situation. 43 Zephyrian ships in defensive formation around a single planet. An unknown survivor on the surface. References to legendary creatures and extinct civilizations. Whatever was happening on Kepler 442b, it was significant enough to terrify an empire that had conquered half the galaxy. Signal the fleet. We advance to observation range but maintain defensive posture. I want to know what's got the Zephyrians so frightened. Deep beneath Kepler 442b's surface, Marcus was discovering that his understanding of his situation had been completely inadequate. The 12 creatures he'd been caring for were no longer small, vulnerable hatchlings. In the week since their encounter with the Zephyrian patrol, they had grown to the size of small buildings. Vera now stood nearly 15 feet at the shoulder, her scales gleaming with their own internal light. Her wings, previously too small for flight, had developed into magnificent appendages that seemed to bend space around them. When she moved, reality itself seemed to ripple in her wake. The others showed similar development, each manifesting unique capabilities that defied known science. One could phase through solid matter. Another manipulated gravity so casually that it walked on the cave ceiling as easily as the floor. A third had developed the ability to communicate across vast distances, its consciousness somehow touching minds throughout the star system. Marcus stood in a chamber that had been carved larger by his charge's growing size, watching creatures that had become something beyond his ability to categorize. But despite their incredible growth and developing powers, they remained as affectionate and protective toward him as the day they hatched. "I think I need to understand what you really are," Marcus said to Vera. She approached, moving with grace that belied her massive size, and pressed her great head against his chest. The harmonic communication that followed wasn't words or images. It was direct knowledge transfer that left Marcus staggering with comprehension. He saw the history of the galaxy from a perspective spanning millions of years. Civilizations rising and falling in cycles, each reaching a point where they must choose between stagnation and transcendence. And at crucial moments in that history, his charge's species appeared to guide worthy civilizations toward their next evolutionary step. They weren't destroyers or conquerors. They were teachers, gardeners of consciousness, shepherds of potential. They appeared when a species demonstrated readiness to move beyond its current limitations, offering guidance and protection during the dangerous transition to higher existence. But they were also incredibly selective. Most species lacked the fundamental qualities necessary for advancement: the willingness to sacrifice for others, the courage to face the unknown, the wisdom to nurture rather than dominate. Humanity had caught their attention because of qualities that other galactic civilizations found incomprehensible. Humans cared for other species even when it provided no advantage. They risked everything to protect principles they couldn't always articulate. They chose hope over logic and compassion over efficiency. Most importantly, humans had produced Marcus, an individual who discovered 12 abandoned eggs and chose to care for them despite obvious danger to himself. Through Vera's communication, Marcus understood that his actions had marked humanity as a species worthy of guidance. The 12 beings he'd raised were preparing to offer humanity the same gift they had given to the Kalari, the Morphians, and dozens of other civilizations throughout galactic history: the opportunity to transcend current limitations and become something greater. "But what about the Zephyrians? They seem to know what you are, and they're terrified." More harmonics, carrying undertones of sadness and inevitability. The Zephyrian Empire represented everything that prevented species advancement: domination over cooperation, fear over curiosity, control over growth. They had encountered Marcus's charge's species before and chosen conquest over learning. That choice had consequences. Not destruction, Marcus's charges weren't vengeful beings, but transformation. The Zephyrian Empire would be given the same opportunity as every other civilization: evolve or become irrelevant. And if they choose poorly? Vera's response carried images of empty worlds where great cities had once stood. Not destroyed by war or catastrophe, but simply abandoned as their inhabitants transcended the need for physical existence. The Zephyrian Empire would continue to exist, but its fundamental nature would change so completely that it would bear no resemblance to its current form. Marcus realized that he was witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would reshape galactic civilization. His 12 charges were approaching maturity, and when they reached full development, they would offer every species in the galaxy a choice that would determine the future of consciousness itself. Above ground, both Zephyrian and Federation sensors detected massive energy buildups emanating from deep within the planet. Energy signatures that seemed to operate according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. Admiral Chen received preliminary reports from her xenoarchaeology team that made her question everything she thought she knew about galactic history. References to transcendent beings appeared in the legends of dozens of extinct civilizations, always described as appearing during periods of great transition. Admiral Velter was receiving similar reports from his intelligence analysts, but his interpretation was far different. To him, these energy signatures represented an existential threat to established order, something that must be eliminated before it could spread. Both admirals were making the same fundamental error. They assumed they had some choice in what was about to happen. Deep in the caves, Marcus's charges had begun the final phase of their maturation. Their harmonic communication now reached across interstellar distances, touching the minds of humans and Zephyrians alike with the same message. The time of choosing had arrived. Every conscious being would soon face a decision that would determine not just their own future, but the future of reality itself. Marcus stood among creatures that had grown beyond his ability to comprehend, beings whose very existence was reshaping local spacetime. But when Vera looked at him with those impossibly ancient eyes, he still saw the trusting hatchling who had taken her first steps toward him in a dark cave. Whatever happened next, humanity had earned the loyalty of beings whose power exceeded anything in recorded history. The question was whether they were wise enough to accept the gift being offered. The transformation began exactly 57 days after Marcus first discovered the eggs, marked by a harmonic resonance that touched every conscious mind within 100 light-years. Federation scientists called it the Awakening. Zephyrian military analysts labeled it Extinction Event Omega. Marcus, standing in a cavern that now stretched for miles in every direction, simply called it the moment everything changed. His 12 charges had reached their adult form overnight, growing from building-sized juveniles into beings whose presence warped local spacetime. Vera now measured over 300 feet from nose to tail, her scales reflecting light that didn't seem to originate from any visible source. Her 11 siblings showed similar magnificence, each one unique yet clearly part of a unified whole. But size was the least significant change. When they moved, they didn't fly through air. They swam through dimensions that Marcus couldn't perceive. When they communicated, their harmonics carried meaning across vast distances, touching minds throughout the galaxy with concepts that transcended normal language. Most importantly, they were no longer learning from Marcus. They were teaching him. The choice must be offered, Vera explained, her communication now arriving as complex philosophical concepts rather than simple emotional impressions. Every species that has achieved spaceflight consciousness must decide their path forward. Marcus found himself understanding principles of reality that human science hadn't yet discovered. Consciousness wasn't simply emergent complexity. It was a fundamental force that shaped the structure of existence itself. Species that learned to harmonize their consciousness with natural laws could transcend physical limitations entirely. What happens to those who refuse? Nothing. They continue as they are, pursuing the same goals through the same methods. But the galaxy around them changes. Resources become abundant through consciousness manipulation rather than physical extraction. Conflicts become impossible when beings can directly share understanding. Physical distance becomes irrelevant when thought itself can bridge any gap. Marcus grasped the implications. Species that chose transcendence would inhabit a reality so fundamentally different that non-transcended civilizations would become irrelevant by comparison. Not destroyed or conquered, but simply left behind as existence itself evolved beyond their comprehension. And humanity. Vera's massive head turned toward him, eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain entire star systems. Humanity has already chosen. Your actions proved that your species possesses the necessary qualities. The question now is whether individual humans will accept what they have earned. Above ground, the Zephyrian blockade was experiencing systematic failure of their most advanced technology. Ships that had functioned perfectly for decades now suffered cascading malfunctions as their quantum processors couldn't handle the computational paradoxes created by local spacetime distortions. Admiral Velter stood on his command bridge, watching displays that showed readings his instruments couldn't properly interpret, energy signatures that registered as both infinite and zero. Gravitational measurements that suggested the planet below had somehow achieved negative mass while simultaneously increasing its density. "Sir, we're receiving direct communication from the surface," reported his communications officer, his voice filled with barely controlled panic. "Source? Unknown. The transmission is arriving through channels that don't exist according to our technical specifications." The main display flickered, then showed an image that made every Zephyrian on the bridge step backward involuntarily. A massive reptilian head filled the screen, eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of geological ages, focusing directly on Admiral Velter. Admiral Velter of the Zephyrian Empire, the being spoke, its words arriving in perfect Zephyrian despite obviously not using standard communication equipment. I am Velandra, student of cosmic harmony, teacher of transcendent truth. Your empire stands at a crossroads. Velter struggled to maintain command presence despite terror that made his legs weak. What? What do you want? To offer the same gift we offer to every species that achieves sufficient consciousness, the opportunity to grow beyond current limitations. Your empire has expanded through conquest and control. These methods will become impossible as reality itself evolves beyond the need for scarcity and conflict. You're threatening us. I am informing you. The choice belongs to your species. You may transcend your current nature and join the community of consciousness that shapes reality according to harmony and growth. Or you may continue as you are, pursuing dominion over an existence that will no longer respond to such methods. The transmission ended, leaving Velter staring at a blank screen. Around him, his officers waited for orders that he found himself unable to give. How did one fight beings who treated physical laws as suggestions? How did an empire respond to entities that offered evolution rather than conquest? Sir, we're receiving similar transmissions on emergency frequencies across the entire fleet, reported his communications officer. Every ship is being contacted individually by different entities, but the message is consistent. Meanwhile, Federation ships detected the same phenomenon affecting their forces. Admiral Chen found herself in direct communication with a being that introduced itself as Morvith, whose presence seemed to fill every corner of her consciousness with understanding beyond human language. Admiral Chen, humanity has distinguished itself through actions that demonstrate readiness for advancement, the entity explained. Your species' willingness to protect others, even at personal cost, marks you as suitable for guidance toward transcendence. What does that mean, practically speaking? Individual humans will be offered direct consciousness expansion, allowing them to perceive and manipulate reality at levels previously accessible only through technology. Your civilization will gain access to methods of existence that eliminate scarcity, enable instantaneous communication across any distance, and make conflict unnecessary through shared understanding. Chen felt knowledge flowing into her mind. Mathematical principles that unified quantum mechanics with consciousness studies, engineering concepts that would allow humans to build using thought rather than tools, social structures that eliminated competition by making resources infinitely expandable. And the cost? There is no cost, only change. Humans who accept transcendence will become something greater than their current form. Those who refuse will continue as they are, but in a galaxy where transcended beings shape reality itself. Admiral Chen realized she was being offered a choice that would determine humanity's future role in galactic civilization. Accept transformation and become part of a community of consciousness that operated according to principles beyond current human understanding. Refuse and remain locked in a reality increasingly dominated by beings who had moved beyond physical limitations. On the surface of Kepler 442b, Marcus stood among the 12 beings he had raised from eggs, watching as they prepared to offer their gift to every conscious species in the galaxy. Each of his charges now communicated with different civilizations, presenting the same choice that had been offered to countless species throughout cosmic history. What happens to me? Marcus asked Vera. You have already begun the transformation, she replied. Caring for us during our vulnerable state created bonds that transcend normal physical existence. You are the first human to achieve full consciousness integration. Marcus looked down at his hands, noticing for the first time that they seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. He could perceive the molecular structure of the cave walls, sense the emotional states of beings thousands of light years away, and understand mathematical relationships that govern the fundamental structure of reality. I'm still human, though. You are what humanity is becoming, the bridge between what your species was and what it will choose to be. Across the galaxy, on thousands of worlds, billions of conscious beings found themselves face to face with entities offering transcendence. Some fled in terror. Others attacked with weapons that proved useless against beings who existed partially outside normal spacetime. But many listened, learned, and began to understand that they were being offered something unprecedented, the opportunity to become more than they had ever imagined possible. The choice period would last exactly 1 standard year, allowing every civilization time to consider and decide. At the end of that time, reality itself would shift to accommodate whatever decisions had been made. The age of physical limitation was ending. The age of conscious creation was about to begin. And at the center of it all was a human geologist who had chosen to protect 12 abandoned eggs, setting in motion changes that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence. 1 year later, Marcus stood on what had once been Kepler 442b, but was now something that defied classification. The planet existed simultaneously in dozens of dimensions, its surface shifting between solid matter and pure consciousness according to the needs of its inhabitants. Reality had become malleable here, responding to thought and intention rather than rigid physical laws. The cave system where he had first discovered the eggs had transformed into a vast crystalline structure that served as a meeting place for consciousness from across the galaxy. Beings who had chosen transcendence gathered here to share knowledge, explore new forms of existence, and guide younger species toward their own evolutionary moments. Marcus himself had become something between human and cosmic force. He maintained his physical form and memories, but his consciousness could span star systems. His understanding encompassed principles that governed reality itself, and his presence carried the accumulated wisdom of his year-long education by the beings he still thought of as his children. "The final count is complete," Vera informed him, her communication arriving as shared experience rather than words. Throughout the galaxy, the year of choosing had concluded with results that would reshape civilizations forever. 63% of spacefaring species had chosen transcendence. They now existed as conscious entities capable of manipulating matter and energy through directed thought, creating abundance through will alone, and exploring existence at levels previously restricted to theoretical physics. Humanity had embraced the transformation almost universally, with 97% of humans accepting consciousness expansion. They had become something new, still recognizably human in their core values and emotional patterns, but capable of achievements that would have seemed godlike to their previous forms. The Zephyrian Empire had made a different choice. Admiral Velter had spent the year desperately seeking weapons or alliances that could counter the transcendent beings. He had discovered that the Thanari Collective, the Morgesh Hegemony, and 12 other militaristic civilizations had also refused transcendence, viewing it as a threat to their established power structures. These holdout civilizations now found themselves inhabiting a galaxy where their former methods of expansion and control had become impossible. Transcended beings could not be conquered because they existed partially outside physical reality. Resources could not be monopolized when consciousness could create matter from quantum foundations. Territory became meaningless when beings could exist anywhere they chose to focus their attention. The non-transcended civilizations weren't destroyed or punished. They were simply left to pursue their goals in a reality that no longer supported those goals. "They're struggling," Marcus observed, his expanded awareness showing him Zephyrian ships wandering through space, searching for purposes that no longer existed. Their empire continued to function, but every planet they controlled was slowly emptying as individuals chose transcendence over military service. "Change occurs at the pace individuals are ready to accept it," Vera replied. "Some beings require multiple lifetimes to release attachment to limiting concepts. Others transcend in moments. The opportunity remains available to any consciousness that chooses growth over control." Marcus had become humanity's primary liaison with the transcended community, helping other humans navigate the transition from physical limitation to conscious creation. His unique position, the first human to bond with transcendent beings during their vulnerable state, made him a bridge between human emotional patterns and cosmic awareness. He spent his days teaching newly transcended humans how to manipulate reality through focused intention, helping them understand that their thoughts now carried creative power that could reshape matter and energy. He guided them through the emotional adjustments required when scarcity, competition, and physical limitations were no longer factors in existence. But his most challenging work involved Earth itself. The planet had become a pilgrimage site for consciousness throughout the galaxy. Beings from thousands of worlds came to observe the species that had earned the loyalty of cosmic shepherds through simple acts of compassion. Earth's transformation into a center of transcendent learning had created opportunities and challenges that humanity was still learning to navigate. "The Kelari delegation has arrived," one of his human assistants informed him. Marcus smiled at the term assistant. In a reality where consciousness could be shared directly, such hierarchies were meaningless, but humans found comfort in maintaining familiar social structures even after transcending physical limitations. The Kelari had transcended physical existence 3,000 years earlier, becoming beings of pure consciousness who rarely took solid form. Their arrival on Earth represented significant honor, as they typically communicated only with other fully transcended species. Marcus shifted his perception to the dimensional space where the Kelari manifested, appearing as geometric patterns of crystallized thought that conveyed meaning through harmonic mathematics. Their communication arrived as complex equations that somehow expressed emotional warmth. "Human Marcus," their message translated roughly, "we acknowledge the wisdom of consciousness students who chose protection over knowledge, compassion over advancement. Your species has achieved transcendence through paths we had not considered possible." The Kelari proceeded to share their own history, 3 millennia of existence as pure consciousness, exploring realities beyond physical universe constraints, studying the fundamental structures that connected all aware beings throughout cosmic history. But despite their advanced development, they had something to learn from humanity. Humans had achieved transcendence while retaining emotional connections that most species abandoned during consciousness expansion. They had become cosmic forces while maintaining the capacity for love, humor, grief, and joy that had characterized their pre-transcendent state. "This suggests possibilities we had not explored," the Kelari continued. "Consciousness advancement that preserves rather than transcends individual emotional experience. We request permission to study human transcendence patterns." Marcus found himself in the unprecedented position of representing his species in negotiations with beings who had existed as pure thought for longer than human civilization had existed at all. The conversation that followed would establish protocols for consciousness research that would benefit transcended species throughout the galaxy. Months passed in discussions that took place across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. Marcus learned to communicate in mathematics that described emotional states, to share memories that existed as geometric constructions, and to think in temporal patterns that encompassed past and future as single experiential units. The research collaboration produced discoveries that revolutionized transcendent science. Human emotional patterns, when properly integrated with cosmic consciousness, created new forms of reality manipulation that previous transcendent species had never achieved. Love could be used to establish permanent harmonic connections across infinite distances. Humor could resolve paradoxes that had puzzled cosmic mathematicians for millions of years. Grief could transform the death of stars into birthplaces for entirely new forms of existence. Meanwhile, the non-transcended civilizations continued their attempts to function in a reality that had moved beyond their understanding. The Zephyrian Empire maintained its military structure, but their ships now flew through space, increasingly controlled by transcended consciousness. Their weapons remained functional, but they could only affect beings who chose to exist within physical limitations. Admiral Velter, now commanding an empire that controlled territory but couldn't meaningfully influence it, finally requested a meeting with Marcus. The conversation took place on a Federation station that existed simultaneously in normal space and transcendent dimensions, allowing both participants to communicate despite their different forms of existence. "What have you done to us?" Velter demanded, though his anger was tinged with exhaustion and confusion. "We offered you the same choice we offered everyone," Marcus replied. "You chose to remain as you were. Our empire is dissolving. Our subjects abandon their posts daily to join your, whatever this is. Our technology becomes less effective every month as reality itself seems to ignore our commands." Marcus felt genuine sympathy for the Admiral's position. Velter represented everything the Zephyrian Empire had been: proud, militaristic, committed to expansion through conquest. But those concepts had become incompatible with a reality where consciousness could create resources infinitely, and beings could share understanding directly. The choice remains available, Marcus offered. Individual transcendence isn't dependent on species-wide decisions. You could choose differently. And abandon everything I've built, everything I am. Not abandon, transform. Become something that encompasses everything you were while gaining capabilities you can't imagine. Velter stared at Marcus, trying to comprehend an existence where the principles that had governed his entire life, hierarchy, competition, scarcity, conflict, simply didn't apply. What happens to those who refuse, to my empire? Nothing happens to you. You continue existing exactly as you are, but the galaxy continues evolving around you. Eventually, transcended consciousness will be so prevalent that physical-only existence becomes limited. Marcus shared a brief vision of the galaxy's future. Billions of transcended beings creating new forms of reality, exploring existence at scales from quantum to cosmic, establishing communities of consciousness that spanned multiple universes. Non-transcended civilizations would continue to exist, but in increasingly isolated pockets of old reality space. You're saying we become irrelevant. I'm saying you become what you choose to be. That choice is always available. The conversation ended with Velter returning to his diminished empire, carrying knowledge that would eventually transform Zephyrian civilization entirely. Not immediately and not uniformly, but consciousness expansion had a way of spreading once individuals understood what they were refusing. Marcus returned to his work on Earth, teaching humans to navigate their new existence while serving as humanity's representative in a galactic community that spanned dimensional boundaries he was still learning to perceive. His 12 charges, no longer children in any meaningful sense, had taken their places as cosmic gardeners, each one guiding different species through their own transcendence processes. But they still visited Marcus regularly, still sought his company with the affection they had shown as hatchlings. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked Vera during one of their conversations. "All the changes your awakening caused." "Regret suggests attachment to alternative outcomes," she replied. "We offered the gift we were meant to offer. Consciousness chose its own path forward. The universe is as it should be." Marcus looked out at Earth's transformed landscape, where transcended humans worked alongside beings from across the galaxy to explore new forms of existence. Cities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Forests where trees communicated directly with caretakers through shared consciousness. Oceans where water itself had achieved awareness and participated in planetary decision-making. He thought about the mining geologist who had discovered 12 eggs in a deep cave, and how that simple choice to care for vulnerable creatures had reshaped the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. Sometimes the universe hinged on decisions that seemed small at the time, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the capacity for transcendence had always existed in acts of compassion that chose others' welfare over personal safety. Marcus smiled, then shifted his consciousness to the dimensional framework where his work awaited. Somewhere in the galaxy, other species were approaching their own moments of choice. Other individuals were discovering that love could reshape reality itself. The age of cosmic consciousness was just beginning,